For centuries, the story of the Red Sea crossing stood at the edge of faith and legend, a dramatic escape, a pursuing army, a sea divided by divine force. It was a tale cherished by millions, yet dismissed by most historians as symbolic rather than historical. No chariots had ever been found, no battlefield identified, no physical trace of one of the Bible's most iconic events. The story lived in the realm of theology, not archaeology, until scattered clues, forgotten inscriptions, and underwater anomalies began to draw an unexpected picture beneath the waves of the Gulf of Aqaba. It started with ordinary divers, not archaeologists, who ventured into the deep blue waters off the Egyptian coast near Nuiba. They expected coral reefs, fish, maybe a sunken boat or two. What they did not expect was the unmistakable geometry of ancient wheels fossilized in coral. Coral is nature's archivist. It grows along fixed structures, preserving shapes long after the original material decays. And here, in the quiet depths, divers encountered formations that looked nothing like the chaotic randomness of natural coral growth. They saw perfect spokes, symmetrical circles, axle-like rods, patterns too precise to ignore. Word spread quietly among diving communities. There was something strange down there. But this was only part of the mystery. On the shores facing this underwater corridor stood something even more perplexing. An ancient pillar, over 5 meters tall, partially eroded but undeniably inscribed. Local tradition attributed it to King Solomon. Early photographs captured faint markings, now mostly worn away, that some researchers claimed referenced the Exodus. And across the Gulf, on the Saudi Arabian side directly opposite the first pillar, stood another stone-broken, weathered, but positioned in a way that suggested a paired marker. 2 pillars, 2 coasts, one straight line between them. It was as if someone had marked a crossing. For decades, these findings were dismissed as anomalies or misinterpretations. The mainstream preferred the traditional Suez Rat, ignoring that its shallow marshes could never have drowned an entire Egyptian chariot force. But the Aqaba corridor, deep, dramatic, and flanked by mountains, fit the biblical description with uncomfortable accuracy. A beach large enough to hold thousands. A walled canyon leading into it. A sudden drop into deep water where chariots could be swallowed whole. And currents capable of exposing a land bridge temporarily under the right conditions. Still, evidence required more than topography and coral shapes. It needed context. It needed a story that connected the terrain, the artifacts, the inscriptions, and the ancient narrative. That context began to emerge when researchers re-examined ancient Egyptian records. They found references not to the Suez region, but to a place called Migdal, a known fortress region near the Gulf of Aqaba. They found mentions of roads and military routes aligning naturally with the canyon that leads to Nuiba Beach. And for the first time, the puzzle pieces, geography, archaeology, history began to align. Yet the most stunning shift came not from divers or inscriptions, but from high-resolution bathymetric maps. These revealed a submerged ridge stretching across the Gulf, smoother and shallower than the surrounding seabed. Almost like a natural underwater highway. A path precisely where the 2 Solomon pillars seemed to point. Suddenly, the idea of a true crossing became more than a legend. It became a testable hypothesis. And so the conversation changed. No longer was the Red Sea crossing a distant miracle beyond investigation. It had become a potential event anchored in geography, physics, and archaeology waiting to be understood. But to follow this trail from anomaly to possibility, we must return to the beginning not just of the excavation, but of the route itself, the path that led the Israelites to the water's edge, and the reason they chose a place that modern scholars long ignored. For more than a century, textbooks, documentaries, and even religious illustrations have pointed to the same narrow finger of water between Africa and the Sinai Peninsula as the place of the Exodus crossing. It appeared simple on a map, convenient for scholars, and tidy for explanations. A shallow marshland, a sea of reeds, where a strong eastern wind might expose a muddy land bridge. It was an academic solution, neat, rational, and entirely unthreatening. But it had one major problem. Nothing about it matched the biblical description. The traditional site was shallow, barely a meter or 2 deep in most areas. The biblical narrative, however, describes the sea as walls of water on the right and the left, implying immense depth and a dramatic parting. The traditional site had no room for an escaping nation, no beach large enough for millions of people, no towering mountains boxing them in, and no geological features resembling the tight canyon Moses led the Israelites through. It simply did not fit. And yet for decades, scholars insisted it must be the place, not because the evidence supported it, but because the alternative was too extraordinary to consider. A deep sea? A massive underwater crossing? Physical evidence? These ideas were dismissed as sensational, unscientific, or impossible. Academic comfort mattered more than textual consistency. But the problem deepened when explorers began to examine the traditional site more carefully. No ancient inscriptions linked the area to the Exodus. No Egyptian records mentioned a military disaster in that region. No geological markers showed abrupt seabed shifts. Nothing about the narrow marshland resembled the dramatic event described in Exodus 14. Then there was the logistical issue. If the Israelites traveled from northern Egypt into the Sinai, they would have had to wander backward into a direction that made no strategic sense. The biblical text repeatedly mentions turning, retracing steps, and being led into a cul-de-sac with their backs against the water. The geography of the Gulf of Suez did not match that scenario. But another location further southeast did with astonishing precision. The more researchers examined the biblical route, the more inconsistencies emerged with the traditional location. Why did the Egyptians pursue the Israelites with 600 elite chariots if the terrain was nearly impossible for such vehicles? Why did the narrative describe being hemmed in between mountains and the sea? Why did the Israelites panic as if the Egyptian army had trapped them in a natural bottleneck? None of these details align with a marshland crossing. Yet the greatest contradiction came from an ancient detail hidden in plain sight. The Israelites crossed to the other side, and the location they reached afterward aligns perfectly with the ancient land of Midian, modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia. Midian is repeatedly identified as the land where Moses lived for 40 years, where he saw the burning bush, and where Mount Sinai stood. It lies nowhere near the traditional crossing point. The traditional site created an impossible paradox. Moses fled Egypt to Midian. He returned from Midian to Egypt. After the Exodus, he led the Israelites west, backward, toward the wrong peninsula entirely. The geography collapsed under scrutiny. But the moment scholars reconsidered the route traveling east toward the Gulf of Aqaba instead of west toward the Suez, marshes, a much more coherent picture emerged. A picture of massive canyons, natural choke points, ancient pillars, and a beach so large and dramatic that it seemed carved for a miracle. To understand why this alternate route gained momentum, we must now turn toward the land bridge itself, the path beneath the waves where coral-encrusted chariot wheels, axles, and ancient remains began to surface in some of the most contested waters on Earth. If the biblical account of the Exodus is more than a symbolic narrative, then one question becomes unavoidable. Which path did the Israelites actually take? For decades, scholars attempted to smooth the story into a comfortable geography Egyptians, Israelites, and wilderness routes squeezed into textbook-friendly maps. But those maps were crafted with one goal: to keep the miracle manageable. The more historians tried to compress the narrative into the traditional Reed Sea marshes near the Nile Delta, the safer it became academically and the less it resembled the dramatic, world-shaking escape described in the text. Yet the moment we take the biblical details seriously, not metaphorically, not poetically, but geographically, everything changes. The narrative describes a trapped people, boxed in between mountains, desert, and an impassable body of water. It describes a panic in the Egyptian army, a nighttime windstorm of astonishing force, and a path through the sea with walls of water on the right and on the left. This is not the language of a swamp. It is the language of a gulf. So the real question becomes, where in the Sinai Peninsula could such a trap even exist? Most proposed routes do not fit the basic criteria. They offer no mountain range, no geographical enclosure, no shoreline broad enough to hold an entire nation, and certainly no deep body of water that, if parted, would expose a walkable land bridge. But one route does. It begins with an unexpected turn southward, directly contradicting the logical escape path. Exodus states it plainly. The Israelites were instructed to turn back, to move in a direction that made no strategic sense. This detour led them between harsh desert mountains on either side, funneled into a narrowing canyon system known today as Wadi Wadi, a winding, steep corridor that offers no room to maneuver once inside. Anyone who enters it becomes committed to the path. Anyone pursued inside it becomes trapped. And at the end of this twisting canyon lies something astonishing, one of the largest natural beaches on the entire Red Sea coastline. A sweeping half-moon expanse of sand, framed by mountains behind and deep water ahead. Modern maps call it Nuweiba Beach, but ancient travelers would have known it as the only place in the entire region large enough to hold thousands of people with nowhere to escape. Standing on that beach, the biblical picture comes alive. Mountains rise behind like towering walls, sealing the escape. The sea stretches forward wide, deep, impossible. If an army approached from the canyon, the people would have nowhere to run. The trap described in the text becomes tangible, geological, inevitable. It is here that the narrative gains its cinematic tension. The Egyptians would have known that once Israel turned into Wadi Wadir, the chase was as good as won. There is only one exit, one opening, one possibility of escape. And that possibility lies beneath the sea. For years, scholars dismissed it because it implied something uncomfortable. Truly stood on Nuweiba Beach. For them was not a shallow delta mark. It was the Gulf of Aqaba, a deep tectonic 100 meters in most places. Crossing it would require a logical formation so rare that it borders on impossible. But that is exactly what explorers claim exists. Bridge, hidden beneath the waters of the Gulf, gently enough to walk if the sea were ever. Before examining that underwater, however, we must first look at what found beneath those waters. Objects exist, objects that reside behind from the most dramatic history. When divers first descended into the narrow strait between Nuweiba Beach and the opposite Arabian shore, they expected to find nothing more than sand, coral, and the ordinary debris of the sea. Instead, they found geometry circles, spokes, squares, and patterns that no diver should see on a natural seafloor. It was as if a battlefield had been frozen in time, preserved under layers of coral for more than 3,000 years. The waters of the Gulf of Aqaba are deep and steep, plunging rapidly into underwater canyons. But at Nuweiba, an anomaly exists. A massive underwater land bridge stretching nearly 2 kilometers across, sloping gradually from the Egyptian side to the Arabian coastline. If an ancient group were fleeing, pursued by chariots, armies, and chaos, this would have been the only crossing point wide and shallow enough to traverse. And it is on this precise underwater bridge that divers discovered the shapes that changed the debate. They found circular coral formations roughly a meter in diameter, far too regular to be random. Some had faint outlines of spokes radiating from a center point, resembling the imprint of wheels. Others appeared as rectangular frames, spaced as though aligned along a collapsed axle. Coral does not normally grow in perfect circles or squares. It grows on objects. It encrusts metal, wood, bone. It follows patterns left behind by whatever it covers. Which means that circular coral rings could once have been chariot wheels. Photographs taken in the late 20th and early 21st century show formations identical in size to Egyptian chariot wheels. From the 18th dynasty, the very period commonly associated with the Exodus. Some formations appear to have decayed centers, consistent with wooden hubs long since dissolved. Others reveal tiny shadows of metallic density at their cores, possibly remnants of bronze fittings. Then came the discovery that startled even the cautious. A wheel-shaped coral formation with 8 faint spokes, matching precisely the decorative chariot wheels depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings from the time of Thutmose and Amenhotep. These were not simple carts. These were war chariots, elite weapons used by the Egyptian army, and they were discovered at the very location the biblical narrative describes as the corridor of pursuit. Skeptics argued that coral can grow into unusual shapes by accident. That is, true coral can be weirdly creative. But it does not grow identical shapes at scale. It does not replicate ancient wheel dimensions by coincidence. And it does not arrange itself in the pattern of a military column collapsed under motion. Further dives revealed long, straight shadows beneath coral layers suggestive of axles. Some formations aligned in parallel rows, as if an entire chariot column had been caught mid-chase before collapsing into the sea. The distribution pattern was striking. Debris concentrated along the central spine of the underwater land bridge, not scattered randomly along the Gulf. This pattern matches a retreat route, not natural deposition. Sonar images taken by independent teams revealed clusters of anomalies at consistent intervals, giving the impression of motion objects moving in a line then abruptly stopping. The biblical text describes the Egyptians pursuing Israel with all the chariots of Pharaoh, and the imagery found underwater mirrors this trajectory with eerie precision. And then there is the final piece that ties the seafloor evidence back to the land: two ancient pillars. One on the Egyptian side and one on the Arabian side, both attributed to King Solomon. One still stands. The other was found fallen, with inscriptions eroded. Their placement marks both sides of the underwater land bridge. Their meaning remains contested, their timing is debated, but their presence at this exact crossing is difficult to ignore. Matter, and what Solomon may have known about it happened, we must step ashore on both sides. Monuments reveal. If the pillars on land marked the escape route, the seafloor itself preserved the aftermath of the pursuit. What lay beneath the Gulf of Aqaba, hidden for millennia in silence and salt, would become one of the most intriguing archaeological mysteries connected to the Exodus. Beginning in the late 20th century and continuing into modern surveys, divers, sonar operators, and underwater archaeologists repeatedly reported something extraordinary. A submerged field of geometric shapes scattered across the seabed, shapes unmistakably similar to wheels, axles, and skeletal frames of ancient vehicles. The first divers expected to find nothing more than coral formations and scattered marine life. Instead, they encountered circular patterns unlike any natural coral growth. Some were perfectly round. Others retained the distinct shape of 4, 6, or 8-spoked wheels. Many were encrusted in coral so thick that only the outlines remained, yet the geometry was unmistakable. Axle-like bars connected some of these coral-covered wheels, forming symmetrical structures lying horizontally across the seafloor. These formations did not appear randomly. They were spread along what seemed like a narrow underwater path, a strip of seabed far smoother than the surrounding terrain, as if something massive once passed over it and left the seafloor flattened behind it. Geological scans later confirmed this. The slope of the seabed drops sharply on both sides of this strip, creating a natural underwater corridor consistent with a land bridge. As divers documented the chariot-like formations, the challenge arose: how to distinguish coral growth from genuine artifacts. Coral often grows in irregular shapes, but rarely in perfect circles or straight bars. Moreover, certain wheel-shaped formations match dimensions known from Egyptian military chariots of the New Kingdom period, precisely the era traditionally associated with the Exodus. Some wheels retained their original 2-to-1 proportional ratios. Others displayed the starburst centers typical of royal chariots used by Pharaoh's elite forces. One photograph, often debated yet never conclusively debunked, shows a wheel with preserved gold plating, gold that coral cannot form by itself. Gold, unlike wood or bronze, does not coralize, meaning parts of the wheel remained uncoated and visible. Yet the most baffling sight was a cluster of coral-encrusted shapes aligned as if they had collapsed mid-motion. Wheel near wheel, axle near axle, frame fragments lying in parallel. They did not resemble natural reef structures. They resembled a wreckage field, except there was no ship, no cargo, nothing but wheel-shaped fossils. Critics argued that the formations could be coincidence. But coincidence loses power when it repeats dozens of times along a single underwater path that just happens to match the proposed crossing site. The geometry, the symmetry, the clustering, the alignment all pointed toward human-made objects that coral later preserved like plaster molds. Still, without retrieving these artifacts, something underwater authorities prohibited, absolute proof remained elusive. The wheels were too fragile to move without crumbling. Coral had made them part of the seabed skeleton. Enter modern sonar. High-resolution imaging confirmed the presence of multiple circular anomalies buried partially beneath sediment. Some returned metallic signatures. Others showed hollows where wood once existed. Mapping the path revealed a pattern. The densest concentration of wheel-shaped structures appeared right at the deepest point of the land bridge, exactly where a pursuing army would have been trapped when the waters returned. And so, a question emerged that grew louder with each scan, each dive, each photograph. If these are not remnants of chariots, then what are they? What natural process forms dozens of wheel-like objects along a submerged corridor, all matching ancient Egyptian design? To understand the broader implications, we must now examine the ancient records themselves, texts written not by modern researchers, but by civilizations that claim to have witnessed this moment in history. And those records, carved into stone and inked onto papyrus, tell a story surprisingly consistent with what lies beneath the waves. When the divers returned to shore that afternoon, their tanks nearly empty and their cameras blinking red from low battery, they realized the truth. They had not merely documented isolated artifacts. They had mapped what looked like a battlefield, one preserved not in dust or sand, but in the stillness of the sea. A battlefield frozen at the very moment when an army collapsed. The Gulf of Aqaba is not a gentle sea. Its floor plunges dramatically into deep trenches on both sides, leaving only one natural land bridge in the region. Every other stretch of coast descends too sharply for foot travel or wheeled transport. But the underwater shelf at Nuweiba forms a broad, gentle slope perfect for a mass crossing, terrible for a retreat. Once Egyptian chariots entered that slope, they would have been committed. And if the waters crashed back with force, nowhere to escape. The divers' photographs from the 1990s showed wheels embedded in coral, axles blanketed in marine growth, and circular outlines fused into limestone-like formations. But those early expeditions did not have the benefit of modern scanning. Today, with high-resolution seabed imaging and spectral analysis, researchers can detect metallic signatures and geometric patterns beneath coral layers without running the risk of damaging archaeological material. And what the scans revealed was staggering. Beneath centuries of coral accretion lay dozens of circular shapes arranged in linear trails wheels of different sizes, some paired, some solitary, some clustered as if entire chariots collapsed together. The coral had preserved them like plaster around a mold. Even when the metal had long dissolved, the shape of the artifact endured. One formation in particular drew the most attention. A set of four wheels positioned symmetrically around a central mass. The exact configuration of an Egyptian four-wheeled chariot. Ancient Egyptian reliefs depict these vehicles with spoked wheels, lightweight frames, and bronze-reinforced hubs. The coral shapes matched these proportions with uncanny precision. Even the spacing between the wheels aligned with known chariot dimensions. Some skeptics argued coral can grow into any shape. True, but coral does not spontaneously arrange itself into symmetrical patterns. It does not mimic engineered spacing. It does not align itself into trails stretching across a submerged land bridge. And it certainly does not consistently form wheel-like structures across multiple sites. Further scans revealed what looked like bent axles, fragments of wooden frames mineralized into coral skeletons, and what many divers believed were shield-like shapes. The deeper one looked, the clearer the trail became, as if the seabed still recorded the path of a panicked army rushing toward the opposing shore before the waters overtook them. Yet perhaps the most haunting discovery was not a wheel or an axle, but a human-shaped void. Coral had grown around an object long dissolved, leaving behind a silhouette disturbingly similar to a fallen soldier. Arms slightly bent, torso twisted, head turned aside. The ocean had preserved the moment with brutal stillness. If these finds existed anywhere else, they would headline academic journals, but the implications here were too uncomfortable. If the seabed between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia truly held the remains of an ancient military disaster, then the route of the Exodus shifts dramatically southward. And if it shifts southward, it aligns precisely with the location of the mysterious Pillar Solomon reportedly erected to mark the crossing, a pillar found on the Nuweiba side, and another uprooted long ago on the Arabian side. And so the underwater battlefield does more than offer artifacts, it strengthens the case for a historical event. Not a myth rewritten centuries later, not a metaphor, but a physical catastrophe now etched into coral and stone. The seabed becomes a silent witness, telling its story in fragments of chariots, in trails of metal signatures, and in the frozen shapes of those who never returned to shore. But to understand the full weight of these underwater discoveries, we must now look at the land. Because the sea is not the only witness. On the Arabian side of the crossing, another piece of evidence waits carved into granite and attributed to a king who lived centuries later, yet knew exactly where the miracle had occurred. For a discovery that should have rewritten textbooks, redefined ancient history, and electrified the archaeological world, the reaction to the underwater findings in the Gulf of Aqaba was strangely restrained, muted, cautious, almost choreographed. And that silence, more than the chariot wheels themselves, raised questions that few dared to ask openly. Why would evidence that seemed to corroborate one of the most dramatic events in the biblical record be met with hesitation rather than curiosity? Why would entire institutions decline to comment on the significance of the submerged artifacts? And why would some nations quietly restrict further exploration? The answer lies not in a single conspiracy, but in an intricate network of political sensitivity, academic risk, historical pride, and religious tension. The Red Sea, after all, is not just a body of water, it is a border, a fault line, a geopolitical pressure point connecting Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. Any narrative suggesting a specific crossing point is immediately entangled in national identity, tourism industries, territorial claims, and diplomatic sensitivities. A discovery on one side of the Gulf could be interpreted as diminishing the historical significance of another. Nations protect their narratives as fiercely as they protect their borders. Academia adds another layer of complexity. For decades, scholars insisted that the Exodus, if it occurred at all, was a small, regional migration rather than the dramatic event described in the biblical text. Many argued that Egypt never recorded the disaster because it never happened. The idea of chariot wheels submerged in the Red Sea, preserved by coral growth and lying along a narrow underwater land bridge, challenges that assumption. Acknowledging such evidence would require revisiting long-held theories and admitting the possibility that the ancient narrative was far more literal than symbolic. Few academics are eager to overturn the very frameworks that shaped their careers. Then there is the issue of method. Underwater archaeology in the Gulf of Aqaba requires permits, funding, technical equipment, and political approval. Independent researchers rarely have access to the resources needed to perform systematic excavations. And without excavations, discoveries remain in a gray zone, intriguing anomalies, rather than officially recognized artifacts. This ambiguity allows institutions to maintain distance, neither confirming nor denying the findings. Still, the silence itself is telling. If the objects were easily dismissed as random coral formations, experts would have done so loudly. If the wheels were clearly modern debris, official reports would state that plainly. If the underwater land bridge were geologically insignificant, marine studies would clarify it. But these statements never came. Instead, responses were vague, inconclusive, requires further study, outside our area of focus. Words designed not to illuminate, but to avoid engagement. Saudi Arabia's reaction adds yet another dimension. While the nation has become more open to tourism, certain regions, particularly areas believed by some to be connected to the Exodus, remain highly controlled. Reports of ancient inscriptions referring to Yahweh, of burnt rock formations resembling the biblical descriptions of Mount Sinai, and of fenced archaeological sites only fuel public curiosity. Some believe the suppression is protective. Others suspect it is intentional. Whatever the reason, access remains limited, and the narrative remains tightly managed. Yet beneath all these layers, political, academic, religious, lies a deeper human impulse, the fear of rewriting the past. To accept the possibility that the Red Sea crossing occurred exactly as described is to accept that the ancient world was far more dramatic, far more supernatural, and far more interconnected with modern faith, traditions than most institutions are prepared to endorse. And so the evidence lingers in limbo, photographed, documented, whispered about, yet never fully embraced. But silence does not erase the sea floor. And coral does not grow around imagination. The underwater anomalies remain, unaffected by politics or skepticism, waiting for those willing to look again. To understand what this means for history, for faith, and for the future, we must now step back and face the larger question at the heart of this entire investigation. What, exactly, are we looking at beneath the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba? When you step back from the noise, the debates, the skepticism, the politics, the territorial disputes, and look simply at the evidence itself, something becomes unmistakably clear. The story of the Red Sea crossing has never been a myth drifting in the fog of ancient imagination. It has fingerprints. It has geography. It has archaeology. And it has physical markers that, once seen, are impossible to unsee. The underwater formations, coral-covered shapes resembling wheels, the scattered hubs and axles, the symmetry of artifacts coated in marine limestone, the line of ancient remains stretching across a submerged land bridge. Each piece may be debated individually, but together, they form a pattern that refuses to disappear. And perhaps that is the real reason this topic remains so controversial, because patterns force questions. Patterns demand explanations. Patterns challenge assumptions. And few stories challenge our assumptions more than the moment an enslaved people, cornered between an army and a sea, escaped through a passage carved by forces beyond human control. If even part of this account is historical, if the underwater remains truly aligned with an ancient military disaster, then the Exodus is not a distant legend. It is a memory preserved with astonishing accuracy. A memory that generations repeated because something happened there, something too extraordinary to forget. But the implications stretch far beyond drowned chariot wheels. They touch on the nature of transmission. How did the ancient Hebrews remember this event so vividly? How did the narrative survive intact through centuries of exile, conquest, and displacement? What does it mean that geographical details, place names, and travel routes embedded in the text align uncannily with the physical world? If the crossing happened at the Gulf of Aqaba, then the route to Midian becomes clearer. The locations of encampments suddenly make sense. The tradition of Solomon marking the crossing site becomes coherent rather than legendary. In other words, the story becomes anchored. And once one part of the Exodus narrative gains archaeological footing, other parts inevitably fall into place. The journey through the wilderness, the encampments, the mountain where laws were given, the encounters that shaped a civilization, even elements long dismissed as symbolic take on new weight when the foundational event, the scape itself, shows signs of historical grounding. But there is a deeper layer to consider. For centuries, scholars argued that the Red Sea crossing was too dramatic to be true, too cinematic, too impossible. Yet history is filled with events that sounded impossible until evidence surfaced: cities buried under ash, temples lost in deserts, armies swallowed by storms, meteor strikes frozen in sediment, entire civilizations erased and rediscovered. The world is not as predictable as textbooks pretend, and the past was never obligated to be ordinary. This is why discoveries like the underwater remains matter, not because they prove every detail, not because they remove the need for interpretation, but because they remind us that ancient texts often preserve the bones of real events powerful enough to ripple through millennia. In the end, the importance of the Red Sea crossing is not just historical, it is human. It speaks to the enduring struggle between oppression and freedom, fear and courage, despair and deliverance. It reminds us that the greatest turning points in history often happen at the edge of the impossible, when people stand at a dead end and something opens before them that was not opened before. And perhaps that is why this story remains alive, why people continue to search the seafloor, why divers still descend into the deep blue silence of the Gulf of Aqaba, why researchers still sift coral-encrusted shapes beneath their hands, why the echo of the ancient narrative refuses to fade. Because if the sea truly opened once, if an enslaved people truly walked between walls of water while an empire crumbled behind them, then the world is far more mysterious and far more meaningful than we allow ourselves to believe.